Hello, guys, gals, non-binary pals, welcome to the Sci-Fi Lab. I'm your host, DJ. With me is my co-host, Harper. And with us we have not one, but two guests Skyping in today. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. Cait, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Cait Coker. I am a longtime fangirl. I'm former special collections librarian, now who's going to the dark side of English doctoral study. But I've been in fandom for 20-something years now, and actually one of my research interests is fan history. So, woo!
Yay!
And don't let Cait undersell herself here. She was the curator of one of the biggest science fiction and fantasy research collections in the United States. So you make it sound like, oh, it was a thing I did. Like, no, you were awesome. I mean, you're still awesome. But you were awesome professionally in that manner. I'm Karen Viars. I'm the Humanities and Science Fiction Librarian at Georgia Tech, where it is my privilege to work with the Science Fiction minor program and the Sci-Fi classes that are part of LMC. I have been a fan since before I knew exactly what that meant. And I would like to say that Cait has actually been a big influence on me thinking about fan studies as a serious thing. So we met each other at UGA as undergrads in the English program there. And now here we are, more years later than I care to talk about, having published several articles and book chapters together about fan studies. So that's the intro.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the beginnings of, I guess, modern fandom would be the best way to phrase that. So we're going to start off with the very earliest, I guess, would be Sherlock. Be Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. So.
Yeah, I think that was one of the first times that people were able to experience something on kind of a massive scale thanks to the wide distribution of those stories. And Holmes was killed in 1893, the point where Conan Doyle was like, well, I'm bored with that. Although I gotta say that the Sherlock Holmes stories worked out way better for him than his whole doctoring career ever did. So that was when we started to see fans really kind of react strongly. And I guess a modern corollary might be, if anybody's familiar with the Browncoats and Serenity, which is the result of that. Yeah, the Firefly fandom is in some ways, I think, a lot like the Sherlock fandom.
Except for the Firefly fandom was defeated by Fox and not by the writer itself.
That's true. It was a more direct relationship with the author at that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, in the early 1900s, you get all of these Sherlock fans who are staging public mourning and wearing black armbands and having generally a fit because their author killed their favorite character. And basically, fans have not stopped since then.
Yeah. It's like, remember, kids, we were always crazy.
That's really true. Fans have always, I think, been really passionate in a way that means that they want to engage with that text more so, and text being used broadly here, more so than somebody who sort of encounters it casually. It's like, well, that's interesting, and then moves on. Like, fans have opinions, like strong opinions, and those opinions need to be discussed at length, perhaps publicly.
At varying volumes.
And at varying volumes, yeah. So the Sherlock fandom definitely kicked it off, although, it's fair to say that never stopped. The Sherlock fandom is still going strong and sort of revitalized recently by the BBC series. Although, personally, we shall never speak of seeing season 4.
we have already had this discussion, you and I.
So I'm the only one who liked it then.
Oh gosh, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
What happens at the BBC stays at the BBC.
So it's really just the latest in a long, long line of what Sherlock fans would call pastiches and parodies, because fan fiction as a concept hadn't been invented yet. But there's about a million different ways that the Sherlock story's been reinvented. So there's a Sherlock ballet.
There is?
I found out there is when I've seen photographs. So that was something that I want to say was in the 1950s, but I'd have to check. I found that out when I was doing some research a few years ago. There's bunches of folks who've written novels, recent novels, and then throughout history, set in that world. So many TV shows, and even really well-known modern authors like Neil Gaiman write in that universe. He did A Study in Emerald, which is a short story set in the Sherlock world. So yeah, the Sherlock fandom wasn't a thing that happened and then stopped. It continues to this day, with, online fandom, but also the Baker Street Irregulars, which were founded, I want to say, in the 1930s. They're the original 20s, could have been the 20s, yeah. By Christopher Morley, who is a writer and critic. And that's sort of the original fan club.
And I know that, at the very least, Britain is getting their money's worth out of those books, because I actually my sister went to Baker Street and to the Sherlock Holmes Museum and bought me a magnifying glass from the museum and sent it back to me. And I was just like, thanks, Mir.
I got to go to a Sherlock interactive museum exhibit last year. It's traveling, and one of the things that they built into it was this interactive element where, like, every time you go to an exhibit case, you get to, like, punch a card or, like, do a rubbing for clues or something like that, so that you're solving, like, a little mystery while you're going through the exhibit. But they're also, like, doing memory checks the whole time, and it'll be like, when you're at case 8, do you remember at case 3 what you saw? And stuff like that.
Wow.
It was awesome.
That sounds really cool, actually. That sounds like, little aside here, I actually really, really like the International Spy Museum, which is in DC, and they have sort of an experience like that. You can go on a, spy mission on your own.
That's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, you and a group of people are just sort of like riding along on this little spy excursion. That's fun. I like interactive things like that. Also, they had an entire exhibit about James Bond, and I am a very big James Bond fan, so yes. But, like, fandom as, like, a subculture, like, when most people think fandom, they think Star Trek. They think, the Star Trek conventions and all of those things. So.
I think Doctor Who as well.
Yeah. So
Star Wars.
Yeah. So, like, science fiction and fandom have, like, a very interconnected history. And I know you could say that at the very least retroactively, Sherlock Holmes is considered science fiction because he's related to Spock. Remember that one?
This is an ancestor of mine once said.
Yes, the Star Trek canon has been nodding in the direction of Sherlock Holmes for a long time. They've had a lot of different references, different versions, and finally, with BBC Sherlock, Sherlock nodded back once.
Once, just the
One
once.
I don't remember, what was it?
Sherlock was freaking out and was freaking out about freaking out because feelings are bad or something.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. So essentially, I'm having feelings and I'm not okay with that. Freak out. And John called him Spock.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I do remember that very vaguely.
Yes. So, taking this back around to science fiction fandom history. So, about the time the Baker Street Irregulars were getting going is also about the time that science fiction fandom was starting to develop.
Yeah, and you actually see the first issue of Amazing Stories. It's 1926. Hugo Gernsback builds into his magazine space for a letters column where science fiction fans can start to identify themselves. They can actually put in their addresses so they can start writing to each other. And almost immediately, the early science fiction fandom zine culture pops up. The earliest zines are late 1920s, early 1930s. And actually, one of the research projects I've been working on is the history of fan fiction. The first use of the word fan fiction is in 1936.
Oh.
And it's very different than what we come to think of it. First, fan fiction means the kind of fiction that fans enjoy. And then by the late 40s, it becomes fiction that's about fans. And it's only in the late 1960s when fan fiction becomes the idea of transformative work derived from another intellectual property.
Huh. I wonder what, like, the second definition, the fiction about fans, like, what that sort of entails.
It'd be wild these days.
Yeah.
So actually, some examples are currently online. A very well-known story is called The Enchanted Duplicator. It's by Walt Willis. It's 1956, I think. It's the whole thing is online, and it's the epic journey of Joe Fan as he leaves the land of Mundania in the search for the Enchanted Duplicator. And it concludes when he is finally, gone through many trials and many interactions, and he's found his people, and he finds the Enchanted Duplicator, which is, of course, the copy mechanism to make fanzines. And so he touches the handle of the Enchanted Duplicator, and it starts to print by itself, because in the hand of a true fan, there will always be texts.
So this is the Excalibur of fan writing, and also a machine that every actual writer wants to own.
Exactly.
Why can't I just telepathically tell this machine what I want to write, and it does it for me?
So what was the first, is it known what the first fanzine was, specifically?
There's a couple of them. The Comet with Ray Bradbury, and then one of the really important ones was the Fantasy Fan, that had a bunch of the early genre big-name fans like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith, among many others, writing to each other and actually sharing early drafts of their stories and poems.
So it was more of a, these are published authors, but they're also fans, so we're going to publish this.
Well, they weren't famous authors at the time. This is when they are actually still trying to make their way through. For instance, Robert E. Howard, we know him today as the writer of Conan and Paul the Conqueror and a bunch of other big-name properties. He was not famous during his life at all. He lived paycheck to paycheck, and he tragically killed himself when he was like 31, something like that. And his reputation did not get revived in the 1950s. But now there's like an entire holiday in his hometown of Cross Plains, Texas. There's Robert E. Howard Day. There's a million comics and books and movies and things. So fandom lives on, even past you.
Which is comforting and also terrifying. It's like,
So that brings up an...
Sorry,
I
what
was
were you
going
going
to say, that brings up an interesting point where published authors or professional writers in science fiction and fantasy have a long history of fandom involvement. And it sounds like from the very beginning. So I was thinking of a modern example would be Naomi Novik, who her fantasy novel, Uprooted, won at least the Hugo. I want to say more than the Hugo a year or two ago. It's a very good book. And of course, she's written the entire Timber series, which is like the Napoleonic War, but with dragons, which is a premise that has worked very well. I think that book has 7 or 8. I'm sorry, that series has like 7 or 8 books. But she's a professional writer, and she was also president of the board of the Organization for Transformative Works in its first few years, and has openly been involved in fandom, online fandom, since the early days, which is something we'll talk about at another time.
Yeah.
But that's something that has been with fandom from the beginning, is this idea that you are a fan and you're also a writer.
Yeah. The mixing of the two. What I really found most interesting when I was looking up, just things in general, just about the beginnings of fandom, was the split between like male and female fandom, and how like female fans just how they interacted with media differently, and especially how oh gosh, what words like they would try to go to conventions and like things like Worldcon, and then just never go back because it was such a white man's area.
Patriarchy.
Don't let them tell you that patriarchy doesn't exist everywhere, because it does. Except for
Worldcon got started in 1939.
Mm-hmm.
So as an example of the time period you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, talking about that gender split, something that happened at the 2014 or 2015 Worldcon was there was a panel on the graying of fandom, and a guy stood up and asked, what happened to all the slash writers? Like, why did that stop? And he had no idea that, all the slash writers who were women went online, while the male fans, they're still very much into print fandom. They still do the print fanzines. They'll often scan them and put them online to share it in other ways, but the print digital divide is very much gendered as well. It's just backwards.
That's incredibly fascinating, actually, because like I know that all of my fan content is gotten via the internet. So, and I thought that would be, the case for most people, but if print fanzines are still a thing.
So, I actually had never heard of fanzines until I started doing this research, but when I was in middle school, I used to get the TV Guide and read. They would have people send in fan stuff, and they would publish it in the TV Guide magazine. And so I used to read that for different science fiction things like Stargate, SG-1, and send in something when the show was being canceled, and it got published. And I had no idea that fanzines existed, or online existed at that point, but I think that it would have been a whole new world if I had realized that fanzines were a thing instead of TV Guide magazine.
It's also kind of funny to think about it now that slash fic was actually printed, like by somebody other than a teenager who wants to read their fan fiction during school.
Yeah,
Printed and... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slash zines in hundreds of fandoms from the 1970s onwards. And there's actually a couple of essays by the fan scholar Joanna Russ. She wrote an academic version of an essay talking about her discovery of slash fandom in the 80s for one of her academic books. And then she wrote the fan version for the Kirk Spock zine Gnome as well. And it's the same sort of thing about finding fanzines at a friend's house and being fascinated by them. And so then she has to go search for them, and she starts like buying them by the dozens, and she's always kind of embarrassed when, she gets this big parcel in the mail and she knows what it is. And just this idea of this private and often erotic writing by women for women that are about these guys. And there's also, like, the idea of the slash designation comes from the print denominations, because in fanzines they would have listings of titles, and they wouldn't actually identify the content per se, but the slash punctuation symbol would be off to one side to denote if it was a slash zine.
Yes.
Because there were laws about, what you could disseminate through the mail, but you could get around this by putting a slash mark versus a period mark.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I think would be interesting to note is a book, and it's available freely online, called Boldly Writing, a Trekker fan and zine history, 1967 to 1987. And let me get the author's name.
Joan Marie Verba.
Yes, you're right, Verba. Which is sort of a autobiographical history of what was going on at that time, like keeping up with all of these zines, and a pretty definitive listing of what they are. But while fanzines often focused on writing, there was also art. This is like maybe the original version of DeviantArt, which is where a lot of science fiction and fantasy art lives these days on the internet. So art was part of it. And there was also fan letters, people who would sort of organize a newsletter where perhaps they had a relationship with an author or creator, and they would provide like a monthly newsletter that's like, oh, they're going to be at this convention and they're writing this book, and like, oh, here's a special sneak preview. And you would sign up for these and pay your dues, usually just to cover postage, and then you would get this once a month or however often newsletter that was like, here's all the stuff going on with your favorite author and their series, and here's how you can connect with other fans. And I remember one that I used to get in the mid-90s had like a section, like the last page or two was all things where for like 25 cents you could write a message to your friends who also got the fan letter and be like, hi, just wanted to say hello to all my friends, and list them out. And it was cute to have that opportunity to get in touch with other people who were as excited about the thing that you were, when maybe you didn't have that nearby.
Yeah. That's also one of the other things that I'm very grateful to the internet for, is that it's so much easier to connect with people who like the same things you do. You don't have to go through like the U.S. Postal Service to start screaming about a book or something. You can
Made it a lot more instantaneous.
Mm-hmm. You can just go on Twitter and be like, oh my gosh, has anyone else read this, please?
Well, that was actually some of the early scenes or letter scenes where, say, a group of like 5, 10, 20 people would share each other's addresses, and they would each add a bit to the letter, and the person at the bottom of the list would make copies to send to everyone, mail them all back, and then they would reorder the list so that, the same person wasn't always responsible for typing up the whole thing. But it was very much this idea of having asynchronous communication over a period of time to talk about someone. And you also see as well the idea of early like handles or pen names being used instead of real names. So, for instance, science fiction author Marion Zimmer Bradley, who is also in Fandom and is now quite the problematic figure, but her fan handle was Estrella through the 1940s and 50s.
That's interesting how Fandom finds a way, and also probably a lot of our naming conventions and things still carry on from those fanzines. I mean, I know that the slash designation does. Also, here's a quick PSA to anybody who is tagging their fanfiction on AO3. The slash designation is only for sexual/romantic pairings. If they are just friends, use the ampersand. Please. I don't want to have to scroll through a billion things, and it's just like, these two characters are brothers, but you're using the slash, but you don't have the incest tag. Like, come on, guys. PSA over. I just run into that a lot, and I'm tired of it.
So one thing I thought was really interesting in fandom was the language they developed. I had picked out a few words that I thought were particularly amusing or fascinating to me, like croggle, to astonish or baffle, concrud, which is falling ill after
no,
going...
That's still in use.
Yeah, no, concrud is still very much in use. I got it like last year.
Dragon Con.
The Dragon Concrud, yeah.
The Dragon Con. There's so many people, and at least one of them has a head cold.
Mhm.
So,
Or all of them.
Because when you're
for all of them.
Because when you're stuck in, like 5 buildings with 75,000 of your closest friends, something's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, ego boo, the gratification of seeing one's name in print.
Fandom is a way of life.
Say that again?
Fandom is a way of life.
Oh, yeah. There's
The
I don't think
acronyms.
it's a debate anymore, really, that I've seen, but it used to be a debate, like, is fandom how you live your life, or is fandom something you do on the weekends? Like, is it a hobby, or is it something that is sort of a template for what you're going to organize other things around?
A
Yeah.
lifestyle choice.
It's the dueling acronyms. So there's like
Well, it used to be, too, that, you had to make time to go to a science fiction convention if you wanted to see other fans. You had to call them on the phone. You had to write them letters. You couldn't, as you pointed out, get on Twitter and be like, someone talk to me about this book.
like guys, I'm dying, please. Which still happens to me occasionally because I only like super obscure things. It's either like super obscure things or like cultural touchstones. There are no in-betweens.
My main thing recently is Star Trek Discovery, because I love it so much, and 2/3 of the people I know are like, I'm not going to pay for that. So I'm like waiting for it to come out on DVD or Netflix or something, so more than 2 people will talk to me about it.
I'm one of those 2 people, and it's entirely Cait's fault.
Nice.
I'm not sorry.
I know you're not.
That's also a big part of fandom. Dragging everyone else down with you.
I will say, after all these many years, she has never dragged me anywhere bad. So
Well, that's good.
There's a high level of trust here.
I feel like this is a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you just threw down the gauntlet there.
I don't know. Supernatural was not my thing, to be fair. Occasionally I am like, it's cool that you like this. I don't like this. But, on the whole, I've got to say, you make friends with people who have good taste and you're fine.
Yeah.
So, do you have more weird fandom words? I hadn't heard Croggle before.
I do.
Yeah.
I have thughead, which is a stupid or incompetent person.
Yeah, that's very old school now.
Some of these might be very old.
Super old
Acti
school.
fan, someone who is actively involved in a fandom.
Yeah, I think those are just like fans. Like there's fans and then there's casuals.
Yeah.
So like, which comes from like gaming. So like you're filthy casual.
Actually, this source site I have gives the date for some of them. So, let's see.
I need you to send me a link to that.
Okay. Croggle is from 1959.
Whoa. Sounds about right though.
And so Ego Boo was from 1947. Rick Sneary wrote a letter to Thrilling Wonder Stories. So it gives some good, we'll have to put the link up in the
description of the video, yeah.
So it says
Yeah,
fanfic was 1976. Didn't someone else mention that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was Cait.
So interestingly, another thing about that 1976 designation, that's what the OED says for the transformative work, but it is citing the anthology Star Trek Lives, and what it cites is a person who identifies themselves as a fanfic writer, but in the same book, they have an entire essay on how to write fan fiction. And it's interesting that it goes to the bio profile instead of the essay citation. /nerd, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. No, I mean, that's very historically accurate for fandom, especially something. Science fiction fandom. No, go ahead.
Filk, is that something commonly known, and I just had never heard of it?
Yep, that's still a thing that happens for sure. There are entire conventions dedicated just to that.
Okay. It doesn't actually give a good definition. It just says that it's recursive. It doesn't have a good definition for it. Among science fiction and fantasy fans to write or perform filk songs is the definition for filk. So
yeah, that is recursive.
Yeah.
Filk is a variation of folk music. So it's music about science fiction or fantasy. I've seen it be original music, but I've also seen it be a popular tune that's been, essentially had the lyrics revised to be about a particular fandom or character or fan experience. Leslie Fish is a well-known filk writer.
Yeah. There's also I know that there's. I wonder if a Harry Potter musical would count as filk.
Oh yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
Because, that's definitely all original music, but it's still, like... I mean, it's called a Harry Potter musical. What else is it gonna...
I have actually seen
All
it.
wizard rock. All wizard rock really would count as filk.
I love that wizard rock is a genre.
It is. It even has its own, very well-known bands.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Do you have any other really weird, old...
A lot of them are just the noun or verb variations of the same words, but there's one that I thought was interesting, gaffiation, or gaffiate, which is to cease involvement with science fiction fandom.
Yeah.
So that's you and Sherlock.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an acronym. Get away from it all.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep.
So that's when people were like, "I've had enough of y'all for a while," and it was easier to kind of. Well, I mean, it's still fairly easy to drop out, I think, if you want to, but we all have less privacy these days. So at that point, you just, stop calling people or going to conventions or participating in your zine and whatever else you were going to do instead.
And basically that you've successfully dropped off the map. As opposed to these days where I have gone through many a fandom on Tumblr, which means I have to go through everyone I'm following and all right, unfollow you, clean out the likes, delete all of the bookmarks on AO3. Just, and it's an undertaking, especially just with how much you can curate now. It probably would have been easier to get rid of your stuff back then when you could just set it all in a pile and burn it. So.
Well, I think about this fan letter I was talking about, the one I was familiar with in the mid-90s. Different people published it, and when I say published, I mean at their house. They Xeroxed and stapled and folded and put things in envelopes and put stamps on those envelopes and wrote your address on it, or maybe later got a computer to print a sheet of address labels. But that publisher changed over time. I mean, that's an undertaking to do every month. That's, hours and labor and things like that. So what would happen is there'd be an announcement, oh, so-and-so is no longer going to be publishing, I'm going to be doing this myself. They'd usually bring in someone new and they'd work together for a little while, and then the one who was ready to go would go. And then basically you'd never heard from that person again.
Dropped off the face of the earth, are you dead?
Yeah, that's like me. I wrote half of multiple fan fictions and then never updated them ever again, and just never even logged back into that account. I'm terrible.
I mean, I also have to wonder what happened in 2009, because if you see a fan fiction that has a lot of views but has not been updated for a very long time, it's generally from 2009. So
Great fail, amongst many other things.
Oh, that's true.
Wait, what?
2009 was the epic race fail, amongst other things, but it was a year-long implosion throughout all parts of fandom regarding problems of number of isms, but particularly race. what I remember in particular, because I was heavy into Star Trek reboot fandom, so all of the wank that I saw was people being incredibly upset that Uhura was the romantic interest for two white dudes. And on the flip side, the people who were very upset that other people would be upset that she could be a love interest because she was a gorgeous black woman, amongst many other things. Bracevale was probably in many ways set up what has been happening with Puppygate and so on the last couple years. The angry, reactionary, conservative corners of fandom that have been very loud versus the progressive areas of fandom that keep trying to push back. And so 2009 was where all of this really came to a head, and lots of people left fandom. They deleted web pages. It was a thing.
Thank you for that, because I've always wondered what happened in 2009, but that was like a bit before my time for fandom. So,
sweet summer child. I can tell you tales of winters past. Winters.
Well, that's what we're here for, so.
One thing I'm curious about is that my general sense is that a lot of folks who are in fandom these days are not really familiar with how it all got started. What do y'all think?
I definitely wasn't.
Oh yeah, no. No one knows, like, the only reason I know as much as I do about fandom history in general is because, like, I've gone looking for it. I've, seen, like, looked for the meta posts, looked for people who were talking about, like, listen, no, the good old days weren't actually all that good either. Fandom is always a garbled mess. So, like, because that interests me, but it's not, like, readily available information. Like, you do a quick Google search and you're going to find nothing. You're gonna, like, you have to start digging. So one of the interesting things for me as someone who does fan studies and science fiction studies is how the two disciplines do not talk to each other, because there are literally a dozen or so books chronicling the history of early fandom in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that fan studies scholarship almost never looks at. But these are like first-hand accounts. There's Damon Knight's The Victorians. There's Sam Moskowitz's The Immortal Storm. There are all of these books that basically lay out the names of people and where they were and what fanzines they did, and so on. And so fandom history is actually incredibly well preserved. it's just that no one knows it exists.
But that's the thing. It's like the science fiction people know, but the fan studies people don't. And I think that difference between science fiction fandom as science fiction fandom versus fandom, if that makes sense, they don't talk to each other.
I did. Oh, sorry. It's just.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I did read about, like, a split between science fiction fandom and what was called media fandom, which was, primarily female and primarily, like Star Trek. It was TV shows, it was movies, and how, like, all of the true science fiction fans were print fans. Like, Worldcon apparently had this really big issue with the print fans being like, these Trekkies, and they would use Trekkie like a dirty word, you would call someone like a slur, and it's just, which is fascinating, and also probably part of the reason why the fan studies people and the science fiction people don't talk to each other, because there's still that sort of divide. Thank you, Worldcon.
That's still ongoing, by the way. I had an interaction with a couple of the old true fans who are insisting that I was not a real fan because, to me, fan writing and fanzines were primarily digital versus the print. Even though I knew all of the print stuff and I knew the history as well as they did. And they're like, well, you're still not a real fan. I'm like, good to know.
Thanks for that. I got my PhD for nothing.
Gatekeeping is so much fun.
Oh, gosh.
Like, if we go back to the Joan Marie Verba text, Boldly Writing, she specifically titles it a Trekker fan and zine history. Like, there's an awareness of the way that word was being used. And a decision not to co-opt it, at least at the time that she was writing.
Yeah, that's always... And the Trekker-Trekkie split is also interesting to me because, like, my dad was a huge Star Trek fan, and he always referred to himself and other Star Trek fans as Trekkies, which I'm given to believe was not generally done by the male fan base, as it was seen as a more feminine thing or whatever.
So there were actually different connotations. There's a great documentary from 1992, 1995, talking about Trekkie, or called Trekkie, talking about this. And it was that designation of, well, Trekkies are the weird hardcore people, and we don't talk about them, versus Trekkers, they're normal, they just really like Star Trek. And it's very much that kind of fan hierarchy of identifying and othering others, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen, like, there's like, that corner of YouTube, like, the weird section of the websites that we don't talk about. And, like, if you've ever been on, like, an anime music video on YouTube, then it's like, oh no, I've stumbled into the weird part of YouTube again, and I'm sitting here like, bro, this isn't even remotely the weird part of YouTube yet. Just you wait.
There was also a Trekkies 2, and there are other fan documentaries. Ringers was about Lord of the Rings fans. Nothing else is coming to mind right now, but there are others, and they can be varying degrees of sympathetic, and can reinforce or challenge those kind of hierarchies that we're talking about.
Yeah. I know that a lot of, like, the opinion articles and stuff that at least I've seen about fandom and fandom culture have always been sort of derogatory. As like, oh, look at these teenage girls, look at how ridiculous they are, and stuff. And, like, sometimes that's a reasonable thing to say because they're doing things like sending death threats to Benedict Cumberbatch's girlfriend. But, on the other hand, that still is the loud minority, and all of us teenage girls who happen to be in the same fandom sort of get exiled to those people.
Well, it sounds like what we're talking about is that there's always been this tendency to dismiss what teenage girls in particular think is interesting or meaningful. And it's not just science fiction fandom, although that's certainly an easy way to look at it. But I mean, Beatlemania, as another example that's contemporaneous with some of the early fandom stuff we're talking about. And so, yeah, more valued kinds of things in fandom are the ones that people with more social privilege tend to think are serious, that matter somehow, that are worth preserving, or that are the real things you ought to be thinking about if you're thinking about this stuff at all.
There was a lot of hatred towards, like, the Twilight fandom and Hunger Games and things like that because it was mostly teenage girls.
And the Twi-Moms. The only thing worse than a teenage girl in fandom
is the middle-aged
an
woman.
adult woman in fandom.
Yeah.
That's really true.
Yeah, I mean, like, same thing with Harry Potter, because that was kids and their moms. Like, that was the entire demographic. That was played out in my own family. It was my sister and my mother. And then me, but I came later.
Well, AO3 has a great census they did in 2013, and all the data is online. And they had something like 10,000 people who entered surveys. And actually, one of the most interesting things I saw was when it talks about the gender identity. Over 93% of respondents identify as female. Less than 3% identify as male, and there is like this 5-6% that identify as genderqueer. So you have more people identifying as genderqueer than male in fandom. which I think is awesome and fascinating.
Well, at the very least, in transformative fandom, because that's, what AO3 is.
Exactly.
And I think that AO3 marks a change in a lot of things, and we can talk more about that in detail. But one thing that's really different is that you didn't have to know somebody to get into AO3, whereas I think with fanzines, you had to know somebody, or you had to know somebody who knew somebody, because they didn't just magically appear. You didn't just do a Google search and behold, fanzines, you know how someone's address and you know how much to send them. And this was back in the days of self-addressed stamped envelopes if you wanted a response to anything. And so part of the way that I hesitate to call it gatekeeping since it wasn't always intentional. But fandom was harder to find when it was first getting started. So in a lot of ways, the internet's democratized access. If you're like, oh, I've heard about this fan fiction thing, I will go do a Google. And then behold, so much more than you ever expected. Whereas, back when things were getting started, you either had a subscription to Amazing Stories, or you knew somebody who had fanzines that could vouch for you as somebody to add to the list. It was more a person-to-person connection, and you sort of encountered it, I think, more serendipitously.
And that might also have contributed to the whole, fans are nerds who live in their parents' basement sort of deal, because, the way that you were just describing it, I immediately got this mental image of, the way, if somebody's vouching for you, you're entering into this cult, which it is sort of a cult, but, just the image of you've got to know somebody to get into this really sort of makes fans feel like they are other, when you're just talking about it like that. So instead of, something that basically everybody does, you can walk up to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and ask him how his latest D&D session went and stuff. So, also, a thing about AO3 is that you don't have to know anybody to read from it, but you do actually have to know somebody to get onto it so you can, make an account and write to it. It's not hard, because, again, the internet, if you go to somebody's, Tumblr account and be like, hey, could you send me an invite to AO3, they'll probably be like, yeah, sure.
Has it always been that way?
I think so.
Because I have an AO3 account, and I don't know anybody.
Nice. I know I at least had to get an invite, and I know I had to invite some of my friends to it. But again, it was just hey, slides into somebody's Tumblr private messages, hey, can you send me an invite to AO3?
I think I got someone from fanfiction.net to send me an invite to AO3. I think that's what I did.
Yeah. So it's not quite open source yet, but it's also or it's not quite completely open yet, but it is far more accessible than a mailing list. Either a print mailing list or an email mailing list, because that also happened with the rise of the internet.
Yeah, that's a later part of the evolution from print to email to, well, I guess Tumblr is the next step.
The blue hell pit. Listen, I'm allowed to call it a blue hell pit. I am stuck there. We all know that it's terrible, except for the 12.9-year-olds who aren't there yet. They're gonna get there.
I was gonna say, it's good while you're in it. And then when you get out and you look back at it, you're like, what was I doing?
Oh, no, I'm still in it. I can't access any of my other fandom stuff as easily unless I'm on Tumblr. But it's not a good place. There are no good...
That brings up another point. What you're talking about is being able to look at all your fandom stuff at once. Whereas back in the day, your fan letter, your zine, your convention maybe was on one thing. You're getting a Star Trek zine, you're getting a Blake 7 zine, you're getting a, help me out, Cait, what were some of the other early ones?
Oh, there were actually a bunch of Gen zines that were any fandom. There were a number of book fandom ones, like Lord of the Rings zines have been around since the 1950s. I know there were short-lived Anne McCaffrey zines, a number of Darkover zines. You name it, it probably had a zine, to be honest.
Yeah, but you had to find those different mailing lists or zine producers and get in touch with them and get on the list to get the stuff. I say get the stuff like you're like going to get this in a back alley somewhere. Like somebody's going to hand it to you out of the trunk of their car and you're going to like hand them unmarked bills. But like
they pull it out of their trench coat, you know, like, hey kid, you want to buy some Slash?
Well, but yeah, you had to know. It was not as easy to pull together all the stuff you wanted to look at in one place. Maybe that one zine is about one thing you're interested in. This other fan letter is about something else you're interested in. Maybe you're getting a newsletter from a fan organization you're a member of, and that includes some notes about this third thing you're interested in. So like, going to different places was just sort of part of the fan experience in order to, if you wanted to do all of that. That's why some people were what was called monofanish. Like you had one fandom. That was your one thing. And that was what you were all about. And a lot of times people would stay in that one and then they'd switch to something else. Versus today where I think a lot of people are multi-fanish, where it's like, I like this one and this one and this one and this one and this other one and this, to varying degrees. And those can change. That can change from day to day even.
Yeah.
And actually, like in science fiction fandom proper, one of the things that they did early on in the 1930s was they founded the Amateur Press Association. And it was to, if you made a zine, you would basically print out X number of copies, send them to the APA, and then they would sort them out and send them to all of the members. This organization is actually still extant, and they do have their own cons that is focused on still sharing their print fanzines. They have it every year. And so it's very much kind of a conglomerate. You make the fanzines, you send them to a central source, they will send them back out there. So that's an easy way to get 500 best friends really quickly.
And that is, I think, a good note to end on for this episode. So thank you guys for talking about the beginnings of fandom with us, and also some modern fandom stuff.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So I guess we'll leave that till next week then.